Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 37. Stern was the law which bade its votaries leave At human woes with human hearts to grieve. Stern was the law which at the winning while Of frank and harmless mirth forbade to smile. But sterner still, when high the iron rod Of tyrant power she shook, and called that power of God. The Middle Ages. The tribunal, erected for the trial of the innocent and unhappy Rebecca, occupied the dais or elevated part of the upper end of the great hall, a platform, which we have already described as the place of honour, destined to be occupied by the most distinguished inhabitants or guests of an ancient mansion. On an elevated seat directly before the accused, sat the Grand Master of the Temple, in full and ample robes of flowing white, holding in his hand the mystic staff which bore the symbol of the order. At his feet was placed a table, occupied by two scribes, chaplains of the order, whose duty it was to reduce to formal record the proceedings of the day. The black dresses, bare scalps, and demure looks of these churchmen formed a strong contrast to the warlike appearance of the knights who attended, either as residing in the preceptory, or as come hither to attend upon their Grand Master. The preceptors, of whom there were 4 present, occupied seats lower in height, and somewhat drawn back behind that of their superior, and the knights, who enjoyed no such rank in the order, were placed on benches still lower, and preserving the same distance from the preceptors as these from the Grand Master. Behind them, but still upon the dais or elevated portion of the hall, stood the esquires of the order, in white dresses of an inferior quality. The whole assembly wore an aspect of the most profound gravity, and in the faces of the knights might be perceived traces of military daring, united with solemn carriage becoming men of religious profession, and which, in the presence of their Grand Master, failed not to sit upon every brow. The remaining and lower part of the hall was filled with guards, holding partisans, and with other attendants whom curiosity had drawn thither, to see at once a Grand Master and a Jewish sorceress. By far the greater part of the inferior persons were, in one rank or another, connected with the order, and were accordingly distinguished by their black dresses. But peasants from the neighbouring country were not refused admittance, for it was the pride of Beaumanoir to render the edifying spectacle of the justice which he administered as public as possible. His large blue eyes seemed to expand as he gazed around the assembly, and his countenance appeared elated by the conscious dignity and imaginary merit of the part which he was about to perform. A psalm, which he himself accompanied with a deep mellow voice, which age had not deprived of its powers, commenced the proceedings of the day, and the solemn sounds, Venite exultemus Domino, so often sung by the Templars before engaging with earthly adversaries, was judged by Lucas most appropriate to introduce the approaching triumph, for such he deemed it, over the powers of darkness. The deep prolonged notes, raised by 100 masculine voices, accustomed to combine in the choral chant, arose to the vaulted roof of the hall, and rolled on amongst its arches, with the pleasing yet solemn sound of the rushing of mighty waters. When the sound ceased, the Grand Master glanced his eyes slowly around the circle, and observed that the seat of one of the preceptors was vacant. Brian de Bois Guilbert, by whom it had been occupied, had left his place, and was now standing near the extreme corner of one of the benches occupied by the Knights Companions of the Temple, one hand extending his long mantle, so as in some degree to hide his face, while the other held his cross-handled sword, at the point of which, sheathed as it was, he was slowly drawing lines upon the oaken floor.
"Unhappy man,"
said the Grand Master, after favouring him with a glance of compassion,
"thou seest, Conrade, how this holy work distresses him. To this can the light look of woman, aided by the prince of the powers of the world, bring a valiant and worthy knight. Seest thou, he cannot look upon us. He cannot look upon her. and who knows by what impulse from his tormentor his hand forms these cabalistic lines upon the floor? It may be our life and safety are thus aimed at, but we spit at and defy the foul enemy. Semper Deo Prosecutor!"
This was communicated apart to his confidential follower, Conrad Montfichet. The Grand Master then raised his voice, and addressed the assembly.
"Reverend and valiant men, knights, preceptors, and companions of this holy order, my brethren, and my children, you also, well-born and pious esquires, who aspire to wear this holy cross, and you also, Christian brethren, of every degree, be it known to you, that it is not defect of power in us which has occasioned the assembling of this congregation. However unworthy in our person, yet to us is committed, with this batoon, full power to judge and to try all that regards the weal of this our holy order. Holy Saint Bernard, in the rule of our knightly and religious profession, hath said, in the 59th capital, that he would not that brethren be called together in council, save at the will and command of the Master, leaving it free to us, as to those more worthy fathers who have preceded us in our office, to judge as well of the occasion as that of time and place in which a chapter of the whole order, or of any part thereof, may be convoked. Also, in all such chapters, it is our duty to hear the advice of our brethren, and to proceed according to our own pleasure. But when the raging wolf hath made an inroad upon the flock, and carried off one member thereof, it is the duty of the kind shepherd to call his comrades together, that with bows and slings they may quell the invader, according to our well-known rule, that the lion is ever to be beaten down. We have, therefore, summoned to our presence a Jewish woman, by name Rebecca, daughter of Isaac of York, a woman infamous for sortileges and for witcheries, whereby she hath maddened the blood, and besotted the brain, not of a churl, but of a knight, not of a secular knight, but of one devoted to the service of the holy temple, not of a knight companion, but of a preceptor of our order, first in honour as in place. Our brother, Brian de Bois Guilbert, is well known to ourselves, and to all degrees who now hear me, as a true and zealous champion of the cross, by whose army may deeds of valour have been wrought in the Holy Land, and the holy places purified from pollution by the blood of those infidels who defiled them. Neither have our brother's sagacity and prudence been less in repute among his brethren than his valour and discipline, insomuch that knights, both in eastern and western lands, have named de Bois Guilbert as one who may well be put in nomination as successor to this batoon, when it shall please heaven to release us from the toil of bearing it. If we were told that such a man, so honoured and so honourable, suddenly casting away regard for his character, his vows, his brethren, and his prospects, has associated to himself a Jewish damsel, wandered in this lewd company, through solitary places, defended her person in preference to his own, and finally was so utterly blinded and besotted by his folly, as to bring her even to one of our own preceptories. What should we say, but that noble knight was possessed by some evil demon, or influenced by some wicked spell? If we could suppose it otherwise, think not rank, valour, high repute, or any earthly consideration should prevent us from visiting with him punishment, that the evil thing might be removed. Even according to the text, a frute malum est vobis, for various and heinous are the acts of transgression against the rule of our blessed order in this lamentable history. First, he hath walked according to his proper will, contrary to Capital 33, quod nullis juxta proprium voluntatem incidat. Second, he has held communication with an excommunicated person. Capital 57. Ut fratres non participant cum excommunicatus, and therefore hath a portion in anathema mananathera. Third, he hath conversed with strange women, contrary to the capital, ut fratres non conversator cum extraneous mulieribus. Fourth, he hath not avoided, nay, he hath, it is to be feared, solicited the kiss of woman, by which saith the last rule of our renowned order, ut fugientur oscula, the soldiers of the cross are brought into a snare, for which heinous and multiplied guilt Brian de Bois Guilbert should be cut off and cast out from our congregation, were he the right hand and right eye thereof.
He paused. A low murmur went through the assembly. Some of the younger part, who had been inclined to smile at the statute De Osculis Fugiendis, became now grave enough, and anxiously waited what the Grand Master was next to propose.
Such, he said, and are so great, should indeed be the punishment of a Knight Templar, who wilfully offended against the rules of his order in such weighty points, but, if by means of charms and of spells Satan had obtained dominion over the knight, perchance because he cast his eyes too lightly upon a damsel's beauty, we are then rather to lament than chastise his backsliding, and, imposing on him only such penance as may purify him from his iniquity, we are to turn the full edge of our indignation upon the accursed instrument, which had so well nigh occasioned his utter falling away. Stand forth, therefore, and bear witness, ye who have witnessed these unhappy doings, that we may judge of the sum and bearing thereof, and judge whether our justice may be satisfied with the punishment of this infidel woman, or, if we must go on with a bleeding heart, to the further proceeding against our brother.
Several witnesses were called upon to prove the risks to which Bois Guilbert exposed himself in endeavouring to save Rebecca from the blazing castle, and his neglect of his personal defence in attending to her safety. The men gave these details with the exaggerations common to vulgar minds which have been strongly excited by any remarkable event, and their natural disposition to the marvellous was greatly increased by the satisfaction which their evidence seemed to afford to the eminent person for whose information it had been delivered. Thus, the dangers which Bois Guilbert surmounted, in themselves sufficiently great, became portentous in their narrative. The devotion of the knight to Rebecca's defence was exaggerated beyond the bounds, not only of discretion, but even of the most frantic excess of chivalrous zeal. And his deference to what she said, even though her language was often severe and upbraiding, was painted as carried to an excess, which, in a man of his haughty temper, seemed almost preternatural. The preceptor of Templestowe was then called upon to describe the manner in which Bois Guilbert and the Jewess arrived at the preceptory. The evidence of Malvoisin was skilfully guarded, but while he apparently studied to spare his feelings of Bois Guilbert, he threw in, from time to time, such hints as seemed to infer that he had laboured under some temporary alienation of mind, so deeply did he appear to be enamoured of the damsel, whom he brought along with him. With sighs of penitence, the preceptor avowed his own contrition for having admitted Rebecca and her lover within the walls of the preceptory.
"But my defence," he concluded, "has been made in my confession to our most revered father the Grand Master. He knows my motives were not evil, though my conduct may have been irregular. Joyfully will I submit to any penance he shall assign me." "Thou hast spoken well, brother Albert," said Beaumanoir. "Thy motives were good, since thou didst judge it right to arrest thine erring brother in his career of precipitate folly. But thy conduct was wrong, as he that would stop a runaway steed, and seizing by the stirrup instead of the bridle, receiveth injury himself, instead of accomplishing his purpose. 13 paternosters are assigned by our pious founder for matins, and 9 for vespers. Be those services doubled by thee. Thrice a week are Templars permitted the use of flesh, but do thou keep fast for all the 7 days. This do for 6 weeks to come, and thy penance is accomplished."
With a hypocritical look of the deepest submission, the preceptor of Templestowe bowed to the ground before his superior, and resumed his seat.
"Were it not well, brethren," said the Grand Master, "that we examine something into the former life and conversation of this woman, specially that we may discover whether she be one likely to use magical charms and spells, since the truths which we have heard may well incline us to suppose that in this unhappy course our erring brother has been acted upon by some infernal enticement and delusion?"
Herman of Goodalricke was the 4th preceptor present. The other 3 were Conrad, Malvoisin, and Bois Guilbert himself. Herman was an ancient warrior, whose face was marked with scars inflicted by the sabre of the Moslem, and had great rank and consideration among his brethren. He arose and bowed to the Grand Master, who instantly granted him license of speech.
"I would crave to know, most reverend father, of our valiant brother Brian de Bois Guilbert, what he says to these wondrous accusations, and with what eye he himself now regards his unhappy intercourse with this Jewish maiden."
"Brian de Bois Guilbert," said the Grand Master, "thou hearest the question which our brother of Goodalricke desireth thou shouldst answer. I command thee to reply to him."
Bois Guilbert turned his head toward the Grand Master, when thus addressed, and remained silent.
"He is possessed by a dumb devil," said the Grand Master. "Avoid these Satanists. Speak, Brian de Bois Guilbert, I conjure thee, by this symbol of our holy order."
Bois Guilbert made an effort to suppress his rising scorn and indignation, the expression of which, he was well aware, would have little availed him.
"Brian de Bois Guilbert," he answered, "replies not, most reverend father, to such wild and vague charges. If his honour be impeached, he will defend it with his body, and with that sword which he has oft fought for Christendom."
"We forgive thee, brother Brian," said the Grand Master, "though that thou hast boasted thy warlike achievement before us, is a glorifying of thine own deeds, and cometh of the enemy, who tempteth us to exalt our own worship. But thou hast our pardon, judging thou speakest less of thine own suggestion, than from the impulse of him by whom heavens leave, we will quell and drive forth from our assembly."
A glance of disdain flashed from the dark fierce eyes of Bois Guilbert, but he made no reply.
"And now,"
pursued the Grand Master,
"since our brother of Goodalricke's question has thus been imperfectly answered, pursue we our guest, brethren, and with our patron's assistance, we will search to the bottom of this mystery of iniquity, that those who have ought to witness the life and conversation of this Jewish woman stand forth before us."
There was a bustle in the lower part of the hall, and when the Grand Master inquired the reason, it was replied, there was in the crowd a bedridden man, whom the prisoner had restored to the perfect use of his limbs by a miraculous balsam. The poor peasant, a Saxon by birth, was dragged forward to the bar, terrified at the penal consequences which he might have incurred by the guilt of having been cursed of the palsy by a Jewish damsel. Perfectly cured he certainly was not, for he supported himself forward on crutches to give evidence. Most unwilling was his testimony, and given with many tears, but he admitted that 2 years since, when residing at York, he was suddenly afflicted with a sore disease, while labouring for Isaac the rich Jew, in his vocation of a joiner, that he had been unable to stir from his bed until the remedies applied by Rebecca's directions, and especially a warming and spicy smelling balsam, had in some degree restored him the use of his limbs. Moreover, he said, she had given him a pot of that precious ointment, and furnished him with a piece of money withal, to return to the house of his father, near to Templestowe. "May it please your gracious reverence," said the man, "I cannot think the damsel meant harm by me, though she hath the ill hap to be a Jewess, for even when I used her remedy, I said the Pater and his creed, and it never operated a whit less kindly."
"Peace, slave," said the Grand Master, "and begone. It well suits brutes like thee to be tapering and trinketing with hellish cures, and to be giving your labour to the sons of mischief. I tell thee, the fiend can impose diseases for the very purpose of removing them, in order to bring into credit some diabolical fashion of cure. Hast thou that unguent of which thou speakest?"
The peasant, fumbling in his bosom with a trembling hand, produced a small box, bearing some Hebrew characters on the lid, which was, with most of the audience, a sure proof that the devil had stood apothecary. Beaumanoir, after crossing himself, took the box into his hand, and, learned in most of the Eastern tongues, read with ease the motto on the lid.
"The Lion of the tribe of Judah hath conquered." Strange powers of Sathanas, which can convert scripture into blasphemy, mingling poison with our necessary food. Is there no leech here who can tell us the ingredients of this mystic unguent?
Two mediciners, as they called themselves, the one a monk, the other a barber, appeared, and avouched they knew nothing of the materials, excepting that they savoured of myrrh and camphor, which they took to be oriental herbs, but with true professional hatred to a successful practitioner of their art, they insinuated that, since the medicine was beyond their own knowledge, it must necessarily have been compounded from an unlawful and magical pharmacopoeia, since they themselves, though no conjurers, fully understood every branch of their art, so far as it might be exercised with the good faith of a Christian. When this medical research was ended, the Saxon peasant desired humbly to have back the medicine which he had found so salutary, but the Grand Master frowned severely at the request.
"What is thy name, fellow?"
said he to the cripple.
"Higg, the son of Snell," answered the peasant.
"Then, Higg, son of Snell," said the Grand Master, "I will tell thee it is better to be bedridden, than to accept the benefit of unbelievers' medicine, that thou mayest arise and walk. Better to despoil infidels of their treasure by the strong hand, than to accept of them benevolent gifts, or do them service for wages. Go thou, and do as I have said."
"Alack," said the peasant, "and it shall not displease your reverence. The lesson comes too late for me, for I am but a maimed man, and I will tell my two brethren,
who serve the rich Rabbi Nathan ben Samuel,
that your mastership says it is more lawful to rob him than to render him faithful service."
"Out with the prating villain,"
said Beaumanoir, who was not prepared to refute this practical application of his general maxim. Higg, the son of Snell, withdrew into the crowd, but, interested in the fate of his benefactress, lingered until he should learn her doom, even at the risk of again encountering the frown of that severe judge, the terror of which withered his very heart within him. At this period of the trial, the Grand Master commanded Rebecca to unveil herself. Opening her lips for the first time, she replied patiently, but with dignity, "that it was not the wont of the daughters of her people to uncover their faces when alone in an assembly of strangers." The sweet tones of her voice, and the softness of her reply, impressed on the audience a sentiment of pity and sympathy, but Beaumanoir, in whose mind the suppression of each feeling of humanity, which could interfere with his imagined duty, was a virtue of itself, repeated his commands that the victim should be unveiled. The guards were about to remove her veil accordingly, when she stood up before the Grand Master and said, "Nay, but for the love of your own daughters, alas," she said, recollecting herself.
Ye have no daughters. Yet for the remembrance of your mothers, for the love of your sisters, and a female decency, let me not be thus handled in your presence. It suits not a maiden to be disrobed by such rude grooms. I will obey you," she added, with an expression of patient sorrow in her voice, which had almost melted the heart of Beaumanoir himself. "Ye are elders among your people, and at your command I will show the features of an ill-fated maiden." She withdrew her veil, and looked on them with a countenance in which bashfulness contended with dignity. Her exceeding beauty excited a murmur of surprise, and the younger knights told each other with their eyes, in silent correspondence, that Brian's best apology was in the power of her real charms, rather than of her imaginary witchcraft. But Higg, the son of Snell, felt most deeply the effect produced by the sight of the countenance of his benefactress. "Let me go forth," he said to the warders at the door of the hall. "Let me go forth. To look at her again will kill me, for I have had a share in murdering her." "Peace, poor man," said Rebecca, when she heard his exclamation. "Thou hast done me no harm by speaking the truth. Thou canst not aid me by thy complaints or lamentations. Peace, I pray thee. Go home and save thyself." Higg, who was about to be thrust out by the compassion of the warders, who were apprehensive lest his clamorous grief should draw upon them reprehension, and upon himself punishment, but he promised to be silent, and was permitted to remain. The 2 men-at-arms, with whom Albert Malvoisin had not failed to communicate upon the import of their testimony, were now called forward. Though both were hardened and inflexible villains, the sight of their captive maiden, as well as her excelling beauty, at first appeared to stagger them. But an expressive glance from the Preceptor of Templestowe restored them to their dogged composure, and they delivered, with a precision with whom it seemed suspicious to more impartial judges, circumstances either altogether fictitious or trivial, and natural in themselves, but rendered pregnant with suspicion by the exaggerated manner in which they were told, and the sinister commentary which the witnesses added to the facts. The circumstances of their evidence would have been, in modern days, divided into 2 classes, those which were immaterial, and those which were actually and physically impossible. But both were, in those ignorant and superstitious times, easily credited as proofs of guilt. The first class set forth, that Rebecca was heard to mutter to herself in an unknown tongue, that the songs she sung by fits were of a strangely sweet sound, which made the ears of the hearer tingle, and his heart throb, that she spoke at times to herself, and seemed to look upward for a reply, that her garments were of a strange and mystic form, unlike those of women of good repute, that she had rings impressed with cabalistical devices, and that strange characters were broidered on her veil. All these circumstances, so natural and so trivial, were gravely listened to as proofs, or, at least, as affording strong suspicions that Rebecca had unlawful correspondence with mystical powers. But there was less equivocal testimony, which the credulity of the assembly, or of the greater part, greedily swallowed, however incredible. One of the soldiers had seen her work a cure upon a wounded man, brought with them to the castle of Torquilstone. She did, he said, make certain signs upon the wound, and repeated certain mysterious words, which he blessed God he understood not. When the iron head of a square crossbow bolt disengaged itself from the wound, the bleeding was staunched, the wound was closed, and the dying man was, within a quarter of an hour, walking upon the ramparts, and assisting the witnesses in managing a mangonel, or machine for hurling stones. This legend was probably founded upon the fact that Rebecca had attended on the wounded Ivanhoe when in the castle of Torquilstone. But it was the more difficult to dispute the accuracy of the witness, as, in order to produce real evidence in support of his verbal testimony, he drew from his pouch the very bolt head, which, according to his story, had been miraculously extracted from the wound. And as the iron weighed a full ounce, it completely confirmed the tale, however marvellous.
His comrade had been a witness from a neighbouring battlement of the scene betwixt Rebecca and Bois Guilbert, when she was upon the point of precipitating herself from the top of the tower. Not to be behind his companion, this fellow stated that he had seen Rebecca perch herself upon the parapet of the turret, and there take the form of a milk-white swan, under which appearance she flitted 3 times round the castle of Torquilstone, then again settle on the turret, and once more assume the female form. Less than 1/2 of this weighty evidence would have been sufficient to convict any old woman, poor and ugly, even though she had not been a Jewess. United with that fatal circumstance, the body of proof was too weighty for Rebecca's youth, though combined with the most exquisite beauty. The Grand Master had collected the suffrages, and now in a solemn tone demanded of Rebecca what she had to say against the sentence of condemnation which he was about to pronounce. "To invoke your pity," said the lovely Jewess, with a voice somewhat tremulous with emotion, "would, I am aware, be as useless as I should hold it mean. To state that to relieve the sick and wounded of another religion cannot be displeasing to the acknowledged founder of both our faiths, were also unavailing. To plead that many things which these men, whom may heaven pardon, have spoken against me are impossible, would avail me but little, since you believe in their possibility. And still less would it advantage me to explain, that the peculiarities of my dress, language, and manners, are those of my people. I had well nigh said of my country, but alas, we have no country, nor will I even vindicate myself at the expense of my oppressor, who stands there listening to the fictions and surmises which seem to convert the tyrant into the victim. God be judge between him and me. But rather would I submit to 10 such deaths as your pleasure may denounce against me, than listen to the suit which that man of Belial has urged upon me, friendless, defenceless, and his prisoner. But he is of your own faith, and his lightest affirmations would weigh down the most solemn protestations of the distressed Jewess. I will not, therefore, return to himself the charge brought against me, but to himself, yes, Brian de Bois Guilbert, to thyself I appeal, whether these accusations are not false, as monstrous and calamitous as they are deadly." There was a pause. All eyes turned to Brian de Bois Guilbert. He was silent. "Speak," she said. "If thou art a man, if thou art a Christian, speak. I conjure thee, by the habit which thou dost wear, by the name thou dost inherit, by the knighthood thou dost vaunt, by the honour of thy mother, by the tomb and the bones of thy father, I conjure thee to say, are these things true?"
"Answer her, brother,"
said the Grand Master.
"if the enemy with whom thou dost wrestle will give thee power."
In fact, Bois Guilbert seemed agitated by contending passions, which almost convulsed his features, and it was with a constrained voice that at last he replied, looking to Rebecca, "The scroll! The scroll!"
"Ay," said Beaumanoir, "this is indeed testimony. The victim of her witcheries can only name the fatal scroll, the spell inscribed on which is, doubtless, the cause of his silence."
But Rebecca put another interpretation on the words extorted as if it were from Bois Guilbert, and glancing her eye upon the slip of parchment, which she continued to hold in her hand, she read, written thereupon in the Arabian character, "Demand a champion." The murmuring commentary which ran through the assembly at the strange reply of Bois Guilbert gave Rebecca leisure to examine and instantly to destroy the scroll unobserved. When the whisper had ceased, the Grand Master spoke.
"Rebecca, thou canst derive no benefit from the evidence of this unhappy knight, for whom, as we well perceive, the enemy is yet too powerful. Hast thou aught else to say?"
"There is yet one chance of life left to me," said Rebecca, "even by your own fierce laws. Life has been miserable, at least, of late. But I will not cast away the gift of God while he affords me the means of defending it. I deny this charge, I maintain my innocence, and I declare the falsehood of this accusation. I challenge the privilege of trial by combat. and will appear by my champion."
"And who, Rebecca," replied the Grand Master, "will lay lance in rest for a sorceress? Who will be the champion of a Jewess?"
"God will raise me up a champion," said Rebecca. "It cannot be that in merry England, the hospitable, the generous, the free, where so many are ready to peril their lives for honour, that there will not be found one to fight for justice. But it is enough that I challenge the trial by combat. There lies my gage." She took her embroidered glove from her hand, and flung it down before the Grand Master with an air of mingled simplicity and dignity, which excited universal surprise and admiration. Chapter 37.
Chapter 38. There I throw my gage, to prove it on thee to the extremest point of martial daring. Richard II. Even Lucas Beaumanoir himself was affected by the mien and appearance of Rebecca. He was not originally a cruel or even a severe man, but with passions by nature cold, and with a high, though mistaken, sense of duty, his heart had been gradually hardened by the ascetic life which he pursued, the supreme power which he enjoyed, and the supposed necessity of subduing infidelity and eradicating heresy, which he conceived peculiarly incumbent on him. His features relaxed in their usual severity, as he gazed upon the beautiful creature before him, alone, unfriended, and defending herself with so much spirit and courage. He crossed himself twice, as doubting whence arose the unwonted softening of a heart, which on such occasions used to resemble in hardness the steel of his sword. At length he spoke. "Damsel," he said, "if the pity I feel for thee arise from any practice thine evil arts have made on me, great is thy guilt; but I rather judge it the kinder feelings of nature, which grieves that so goodly a form should be a vessel of perdition. Repent, my daughter, confess thy witchcrafts, turn thee from thine evil faith, embrace this holy emblem, and all shall yet be well with thee here and hereafter. In some sisterhood of the strictest order, shalt thou have time for prayer and fitting penance, and that repentance not to be repented of. This do, and live. What has the law of Moses done for thee that thou shouldst die for it?" "It was the law of my fathers," said Rebecca. "It was delivered in thunders and in storms upon the mountain of Sinai, in cloud and in fire. This, if ye are Christians, ye believe. It is, you say, recalled, but so my teachers have not taught me." "Let our chaplain," said Beaumanoir, "stand forth, and tell this obstinate infidel—" "Forgive the interruption," said Rebecca meekly. "I am a maiden, unskilled to dispute for my religion, but I can die for it, if it be God's will. Let me pray your answer to my demand of a champion." "Give me her glove," said Beaumanoir. "This is indeed," he continued, as he looked at the flimsy texture and slender fingers, "a slight and frail gage for a purpose so deadly. Seest thou, Rebecca, as this thin and light glove of thine is to one of our heavy steel gauntlets, so is thy cause to that of the Temple, for it is our order which thou hast defied." "Cast my innocence into the scale," answered Rebecca, "and the glove of silk shall outweigh the glove of iron." "Then thou dost persist in thy refusal to confess thy guilt, and in that bold challenge which thou hast made?" "I do persist, noble sir," answered Rebecca. "So be it then, in the name of Heaven," said the Grand Master, "and may God show the right." "Amen," replied the preceptors around him, and the word was deeply echoed by the whole assembly. "Brethren," said Beaumanoir, "you are aware that we might well have refused to this woman the benefit of the trial by combat; but though a Jewess and an unbeliever, she is also a stranger and defenseless, and God forbid that she should ask the benefit of our mild laws, and that it should be refused to her. Moreover, we are knights and soldiers as well as men of religion, and shame it were to us upon any pretense to refuse proffered combat. Thus, therefore, stands the case. Rebecca, the daughter of Isaac of York, is, by many frequent and suspicious circumstances, defamed of sorcery practised on the person of a noble knight of our holy order, and hath challenged the combat in proof of her innocence. To whom, reverend brethren, is it your opinion that we should deliver the gage of battle, naming him, at the same time, to be our champion on the field?" "To Brian de Bois Guilbert, whom it chiefly concerns," said the Preceptor of good Ulrich, "and who, moreover, best knows how the truth stands in this matter." "But if," said the Grand Master, "our brother Brian be under the influence of a charm or a spell, we speak but for the sake of precaution, for to the arm of none of our holy order would we more willingly confide this or a more weighty cause." "Reverend father," answered the Preceptor of good Ulrich, "no spell can affect the champion who comes forward to fight for the judgment of God." "Thou sayest right, brother," said the Grand Master. "Albert Malvoisin, give this gage of battle to Brian de Bois Guilbert. It is our charge to thee, brother," he continued, addressing himself to Bois Guilbert, "that thou do thy battle manfully, nothing doubting that the good cause shall triumph. And do thou, Rebecca, attend, that we assign thee the 3rd day from the present to find a champion." "That is but brief space," answered Rebecca, "for a stranger, who is also of another faith, to find one who will do battle, wagering life and honour for her cause, against a knight who is called an approved soldier." "We may not extend it," answered the Grand Master. "The field must be foughten in our own presence, and divers weighty causes call us on the 4th day from hence." "God's will be done!" said Rebecca. "I put my trust in Him, to whom an instant is as effectual to save as a whole age." "Thou hast spoken well, damsel," said the Grand Master, "but well know we who can array himself like an angel of light. It remains but to name a fitting place of combat, and, if it so hap, also of execution. Where is the Preceptor of this house?" Albert Malvoisin, still holding Rebecca's glove in his hand, was speaking to Bois Guilbert very earnestly, but in a low voice. "How!" said the Grand Master, "will he not receive the gage?" "He will, he doth, most reverend father," said Malvoisin, slipping the glove under his own mantle. "And for the place of combat, I hold the fittest to be the lists of Saint George belonging to this Preceptory, and used by us for military exercise." "It is well," said the Grand Master. "Rebecca, in those lists shalt thou produce thy champion; and if thou failest to do so, or if thy champion shall be discomfited by the judgment of God, thou shalt then die the death of a sorceress, according to doom. Let this our judgment be recorded, and the record read aloud, that no one may pretend ignorance." One of the chaplains, who acted as clerks to the chapter, immediately engrossed the order in a huge volume, which contained the proceedings of the Templar Knights when solemnly assembled on such occasions; and when he had finished writing, the other read aloud the sentence of the Grand Master, which, when translated from the Norman French in which it was couched, was expressed as follows: "Rebecca, a Jewess, daughter of Isaac of York, being attainted of sorcery, seduction, and other damnable practices, practised on a knight of the most holy order of the Temple of Zion, doth deny the same, and saith that the testimony delivered against her this day is false, wicked, and disloyal; and that by lawful assoin of her body as being unable to combat on her own behalf, she doth offer, by a champion instead thereof, to avouch her case, he performing his loyal devoir in all knightly sort, with such arms as to gage of battle do fully appertain, and that at her peril and cost. And therewith she proffered her gage. And the gage having been delivered to the noble lord and knight Brian de Bois Guilbert of the Holy Order of the Temple of Zion, he was appointed to do this battle, in behalf of his order and himself, as injured and impaired by the practices of the appellant. Wherefore the most reverend father and puissant lord, Lucas Marquis de Beaumanoir, did allow of the said challenge, and of the said assoin of the appellant's body, and assigned the 3rd day for the said combat, the place being the enclosure called the Lists of Saint George, near to the Preceptory of Templestowe; and the Grand Master appoints the appellant to appear there by her champion, on pain of doom, as a person convicted of sorcery or seduction, and also the defendant so to appear, under the penalty of being held and adjudged recreant in case of default, and the noble lord and most reverend father aforesaid appointed the battle to be done in his own presence, and according to all that is commendable and profitable in such a case, and may God aid the just cause." "Amen," said the Grand Master, and the word was echoed by all around. Rebecca spoke not, but she looked up to heaven, and, folding her hands, remained for a minute without change of attitude. She then modestly reminded the Grand Master that she ought to be permitted some opportunity of free communication with her friends, for the purpose of making her condition known to them, and procuring, if possible, some champion to fight on her behalf. "It is just and lawful," said the Grand Master. "Choose what messenger thou shalt trust, and he shall have free communication with thee in thy prison chamber." "Is there," said Rebecca, "any one here who, either for love of a good cause, or of ample hire, will do the errand of a distressed being?" All were silent, for none thought it safe, in the presence of the Grand Master, to avow any interest in the calumniated prisoner, lest he should be suspected of leaning towards Judaism. Not even the prospect of reward, far less any feelings of compassion alone, could surmount this apprehension. Rebecca stood for a few moments in indescribable anxiety, and then exclaimed, "Is it really thus? And, in English land, am I to be deprived of the poor chance of safety which remains to me, for want of an act of charity which would not be refused to the worst criminal?" Higg, the son of Snell, at length replied, "I am but a maimed man, but that I can at all stir or move was owing to her charitable assistance. I will do thine errand," he added, addressing Rebecca, "as well as a crippled object can, and happy were my limbs fleet enough to repair the mischief done by my tongue. Alas, when I boasted of thy charity, I little thought I was leading thee into danger." "God," said Rebecca, "is the disposer of all. He can turn back the captivity of Judah, even by the weakest instrument. To execute his message the snail is as sure a messenger as the falcon. Seek out Isaac of York. Here is that will pay for horse and man. Let him have this scroll. I know not if it be of heaven, the spirit which inspires me, but most truly do I judge that I am not to die this death, and that a champion will be raised up for me. Farewell! Life and death are in thy haste." The peasant took the scroll, which contained only a few lines in Hebrew. Many of the crowd would have dissuaded him from touching a document so suspicious, but Higg was resolute in the service of his benefactress. She had saved his body, he said, and he was confident she did not mean to peril his soul. "I will get me," he said, "my neighbour Buthan's good capel, and I will be at York within as brief space as man and beast may." But as it fortuned, he had no occasion to go so far, for within a quarter of a mile from the gate of the Preceptory he met with two riders, whom, by their dress and their huge yellow caps, he knew to be Jews, and, on approaching more nearly, discovered that one of them was his ancient employer, Isaac of York. The other was the Rabbi Ben Samuel, and both had approached as near to the Preceptory as they dared, on hearing that the Grand Master had summoned a chapter for the trial of a sorceress. "Brother Ben Samuel," said Isaac, "my soul is disquieted, and I wot not why. This charge of necromancy is right often used for cloaking evil practices on our people." "Be of good comfort, brother," said the physician. "Thou canst deal with the Nazarenes as one possessing the mammon of unrighteousness, and canst therefore purchase immunity at their hands. It rules the savage minds of those ungodly men, even as the signet of the mighty Solomon was said to command the evil genii. But what poor wretch comes hither upon his crutches, desiring, as I think, some speech of me? Friend," continued the physician, addressing Higg, the son of Snell, "I refuse thee not the aid of mine art, but I relieve not with one asper those who beg for alms upon the highway. Out upon thee! Hast thou the palsy in thy legs? Then let thy hands work for thy livelihood; for, albeit thou beest unfit for a speedy post, or for a careful shepherd, or for the warfare, or for the service of a hasty master, yet there be occupations. How now, brother?" said he, interrupting his harangue to look towards Isaac, who had but glanced at the scroll which Higg offered, when, uttering a deep groan, he fell from his mule like a dying man, and lay for a minute insensible. The Rabbi now dismounted in great alarm, and hastily applied the remedies which his art suggested for the recovery of his companion. He had even taken from his pocket a cupping apparatus, and was about to proceed to phlebotomy, when the object of his anxious solicitude suddenly revived. but it was to dash his cap from his head, and to throw dust on his gray hairs. The physician was at first inclined to ascribe this sudden and violent emotion to the effects of insanity, and, adhering to his original purpose, began once again to handle his implements. But Isaac soon convinced him of his error. "Child of my sorrow," he said, "well shouldst thou be called Benoni instead of Rebecca. Why should thy death bring down my gray hairs to the grave, till, in the bitterness of my heart, I curse God and die?" "Brother," said the Rabbi, in great surprise, "art thou a father in Israel, and dost thou utter words like unto these? I trust that the child of thy house yet liveth?" "She liveth," answered Isaac, "but it is as Daniel, who was called Belteshazzar, even when within the den of the lions. She is captive unto those men of Belial, and they will wreak their cruelty upon her, sparing neither for her youth nor her comely favor. Oh, she was as a crown of green palms to my gray locks. She must wither in a night, like the gourd of Jonah. Child of my love, child of my old age, O Rebekah, daughter of Rachel, the darkness of the shadow of death hath encompassed thee." "Yet read the scroll," said the Rabbi. "Peradventure it may be that we may yet find out a way of deliverance." "Do thou read, brother," answered Isaac, "for mine eyes are as a fountain of water." The physician read, but in their native language, the following words: "To Isaac, the son of Adonikam, whom the Gentiles call Isaac of York, peace and the blessing of the promise be multiplied unto thee. My father, I am as one doomed to die for that which my soul knoweth not, even for the crime of witchcraft. My father, if a strong man can be found to do battle for my cause with sword and spear, according to the custom of the Nazarenes, and that within the lists of Templestowe, on the 3rd day from this time, peradventure our father's God will give him strength to defend the innocent, and her who hath none to help her. But if this may not be, let the virgins of our people mourn for me as for one cast off, and for the hart that is stricken by the hunter, and for the flower which is cut down by the scythe of the mower. Wherefore look now what thou doest, and whether there be any rescue. One Nazarene warrior might indeed bear arms in my behalf, even Wilfred, son of Cedric, whom the Gentiles call Ivanhoe. But he may not yet endure the weight of his armor. Nevertheless, send the tidings unto him, my father, for he hath favor among the strong men of his people, and as he was our companion in the house of bondage, he may find some one to do battle for my sake. And say unto him, even unto Wilfred, the son of Cedric, that if Rebecca live, or if Rebecca die, she liveth or dieth wholly free of the guilt she is charged withal. And if it be the will of God that thou shalt be deprived of thy daughter, do not thou tarry, old man, in this land of bloodshed and cruelty, but betake thyself to Cordova, where thy brother liveth in safety, under the shadow of the throne, even of the throne of Boabdil the Saracen, for less cruel are the cruelties of the Moors unto the race of Jacob than the cruelties of the Nazarenes of England." Isaac listened with tolerable composure while Ben Samuel read the letter, and then again resumed the gestures and exclamations of oriental sorrow, tearing his garments, besprinkling his head with dust, and ejaculating, "My daughter, flesh of my flesh, and bone of my bone!" "Yet," said the Rabbi, "take courage, for this grief availeth nothing. Gird up thy loins, and seek out this Wilfred, the son of Cedric. It may be he will help thee with counsel or with strength, for the youth hath favor in the eyes of Richard, called of the Nazarenes Cœur de Lion, and the tidings that he hath returned are constant in the land. It may be that he may obtain his letter and his signet, commanding these men of blood, who take their name from the temple to the dishonor thereof, that they proceed not in their purposed wickedness." "I will seek him out," said Isaac, "for he is a good youth, and hath compassion for the exile of Jacob. But he cannot bear his armor, and what other Christian shall do battle for the oppressed of Zion?" "Nay, but," said the Rabbi, "thou speakest as one that knoweth not the Gentiles. With gold shalt thou buy their valor, even as with gold thou buyest thine own safety. Be of good courage, and do thou set forward to find out this Wilfred of Ivanhoe. I will also up and be doing, for great sin it were to leave thee in thy calamity. I will hie me to the city of York, where many warriors and strong men are assembled, and doubt not I will find among them some one who will do battle for thy daughter. For gold is their god, and for riches will they pawn their lives as well as their lands. Thou wilt fulfill, my brother, such promise as I may make unto them in thy name?" "Assuredly, brother," said Isaac, "and Heaven be praised that raised me up a comforter in my misery. Howbeit, grant them not their full demand at once, for thou shalt find it the quality of this accursed people that they will ask pounds, and peradventure accept of ounces. Nevertheless, be it as thou willest, for I am distracted in this thing, and what would my gold avail me if the child of my love should perish?" "Farewell," said the physician, "and may it be to thee as thy heart desireth." They embraced accordingly, and departed on their several roads. The crippled peasant remained for some time looking after them. "These dog Jews," said he, "to take no more notice of a free guild brother, than if I were a bond slave or a Turk, or a circumcised Hebrew like themselves! They might have flung me a mancus or two, however. I was not obliged to bring their unhallowed scrawls, and run the risk of being bewitched, as more folks than one told me. And what care I for the bit of gold that the wench gave me, if I am to come to harm from the priest next Easter at confession, and be obliged to give him twice as much to make it up with him, and be called the Jews' flying post all my life, as it may hap, into the bargain? I think I was bewitched in earnest when I was beside that girl. But it was always so with Jew or Gentile, whosoever came near her. None could stay when she had an errand to go. And still, whenever I think of her, I would give shop and tools to save her life." Chapter 39. O maid, unrelenting and cold as thou art, my bosom is proud as thine own. Seward. It was in the twilight of the day when her trial, if it could be called such, had taken place, that a low knock was heard at the door of Rebecca's prison chamber. It disturbed not the inmate, who was then engaged in the evening prayer recommended by her religion, and which concluded with a hymn we have ventured thus to translate into English. When Israel, of the Lord beloved, out of the land of bondage came, her father's God before her moved, an awful guide in smoke and flame. By day, along the astonished lands, the cloudy pillar glided slow. By night, Arabia's crimsoned sands returned the fiery columns' glow. There rose the choral hymn of praise, and trump and timbrel answered keen, and Zion's daughters poured their lays, with priests and warriors' voice between. No portents now our foes amaze, forsaken Israel wanders lone. Our fathers would not know thy ways, and thou hast left them on their own. But present still, though now unseen, when brightly shines the prosperous day, be thoughts of thee a cloudy screen to temper the deceitful ray. And oh, when stoops on Judah's path, in shade and storm the frequent night, be thou, long-suffering, slow to wrath, a burning and a shining light. Our harps we left by Babel's streams, the tyrant's jest, the Gentile's scorn. No censer round our altar beams, and mute our timbrel, trump, and horn. But thou hast said, the blood of goat, the flesh of rams, I will not prize. A contrite heart and humble thought are mine accepted sacrifice. When the sounds of Rebecca's devotional hymn had died away in silence, the low knock at the door was again renewed. "Enter," she said, "if thou art a friend, and if a foe, I have not the means of refusing thy entrance." "I am," said Brian de Bois Guilbert, entering the apartment, "friend or foe, Rebecca, as the event of this interview shall make me." Alarmed at the sight of this man, whose licentious passion she considered as the root of her misfortunes, Rebecca drew backward with a cautious and alarmed, yet not a timorous demeanor, into the farthest corner of the apartment, as if determined to retreat as far as she could, but to stand her ground when retreat became no longer possible. She drew herself into an attitude not of defiance, but of resolution, as one that would avoid provoking assault, yet was resolute to repel it, being offered to the utmost of her power. "You have no reason to fear me, Rebecca," said the Templar, "or if I must so qualify my speech, you have at least now no reason to fear me." "I fear you not, Sir Knight," replied Rebecca, although her short-drawn breath seemed to belie the heroism of her accents. "My trust is strong, and I fear thee not." "You have no cause," answered Bois Guilbert, gravely. "My former frantic attempts you have not now to dread. Within your call are guards, over whom I have no authority. They are designed to conduct you to death, Rebecca, yet would not suffer you to be insulted by any one, even by me, were my frenzy, for frenzy it is, to urge me so far." "May Heaven be praised!" said the Jewess. "Death is the least of my apprehensions in this den of evil." "Ay," replied the Templar, "the idea of death is easily received by the courageous mind, when the road to it is sudden and open. A thrust with a lance, a stroke with a sword, were to me little; to you, a spring from a dizzy battlement, a stroke with a sharp poniard, has no terrors, compared with what either thinks disgrace. Mark me, I say this, perhaps mine own sentiments of honour are not less fantastic, Rebecca, than thine are, but we know alike how to die for them." "Unhappy man," said the Jewess, "and art thou condemned to expose thy life for principles, of which thy sober judgment does not acknowledge the solidity? Surely this is a parting with your treasure for that which is not bread, but deem not so of me. Thy resolution may fluctuate on the wild and changeful billows of human opinion, but mine is anchored on the rock of ages." "Silence, maiden," answered the Templar; "such discourse now avails but little. Thou art condemned to die not a sudden and easy death, such as misery chooses, and despair welcomes, but a slow, wretched, protracted course of torture, suited to what the diabolical bigotry of these men calls thy crime." "And to whom, if such my fate, to whom do I owe this?" said Rebecca. "Surely only to him, who, for a most selfish and brutal cause, dragged me hither, and who now, for some unknown purpose of his own, strives to exaggerate the wretched fate to which he exposed me." "Think not," said the Templar, "that I have so exposed thee. I would have bucklered thee against such danger with my own bosom, as freely as ever I exposed it to the shafts which had otherwise reached thy life." "Had thy purpose been the honourable protection of the innocent," said Rebecca, "I had thanked thee for thy care. As it is, thou hast claimed merit for it so often, that I tell thee life is worth nothing to me, preserved at the price which thou wouldst exact for it." "Truce with thine upbraidings, Rebecca," said the Templar. "I have my own cause of grief, and brook not that thy reproaches should add to it." "What is thy purpose then, Sir Knight?" said the Jewess. "Speak it briefly. If thou hast aught to do, save to witness the misery thou hast caused, let me know it; and then, if so it please you, leave me to myself. The step between time and eternity is short but terrible, and I have few moments to prepare for it." "I perceive, Rebecca," said Bois Guilbert, "that thou dost continue to burden me with the charge of distresses, which most fain would I have prevented." "Sir Knight," said Rebecca, "I would avoid reproaches. But what is more certain than that I owe my death to thine unbridled passion?" "You err," said the Templar hastily, "if you impute what I could neither foresee nor prevent to my purpose or agency. Could I guess the unexpected arrival of yon dotard, whom some flashes of frantic valour, and the praises yielded by fools to the stupid self-torments of an ascetic, have raised for the present above his own merits, above common sense, above me, and above the hundreds of our order, who think and feel as men free from such silly and fantastic prejudices as are the grounds of his opinions and actions?" "Yet," said Rebecca, "you say to judge upon me, innocent, most innocent, as you knew me to be, you concurred in my condemnation, and, if I are right understood, are yourself to appear in arms to assert my guilt, and assure my punishment." "Thy patience, maiden," replied the Templar. "No race knows so well as thine own tribes how to submit to the time, and so to trim their bark as to make advantage even of an adverse wind." "Lamented be the hour," said Rebecca, "that has taught such art to the house of Israel; but adversity bends the heart as fire bends the stubborn steel, and those who are no longer their own governors, and the denizens of their own free independent state, must crouch before strangers. It is our curse, Sir Knight, deserved, doubtless, by our own misdeeds and those of our fathers; but you who boast your freedom as your birthright, how much deeper is your disgrace when you stoop to soothe the prejudices of others, and that against your own conviction?" "Your words are bitter, Rebecca," said Bois Guilbert, pacing the apartment with impatience. "But I come not hither to bandy reproaches with you. Know that Bois Guilbert yields not to created man, although circumstances may for a time induce him to alter his plan. His will is the mountain stream, which may indeed be turned for a little space aside by the rock, but fails not to find its course to the ocean. That scroll which warned thee to demand a champion, from whom couldst thou think it came, if not from Bois Guilbert? In whom else couldst thou have excited such interest?" "A brief respite from instant death," said Rebecca, "which will little avail me. Was this all thou couldst do for one, on whose head thou hast heaped sorrow, and whom thou hast brought near even to the verge of the tomb?" "No, maiden," said Bois Guilbert, "this was not all that I purposed. Had it not been for the accursed interference of yon fanatical dotard, and the fool of Goodalricke, who, being a Templar, affects to think and judge according to the ordinary rules of humanity, the office of the champion defender had devolved, not on a preceptor, but on a companion of the Order. Then I myself, such was my purpose, had, on the sounding of the trumpet, appeared in the lists as thy champion, disguised indeed in the fashion of a roving knight, who seeks adventures to prove his shield and spear; and then, let Beaumanoir have chosen not one, but 2 or 3 of the brethren here assembled, I had not doubted to cast them out of the saddle with my single lance. Thus, Rebecca, should thine innocence have been avouched, and to thine own gratitude would I have trusted for the reward of my victory." "This, Sir Knight," said Rebecca, "is but idle boasting; a brag of what you would have done, had you not found it convenient to do otherwise. You received my glove, and my champion, if a creature so desolate can find one, must encounter your lance in the lists, yet you would assume the air of my friend and protector." "Thy friend and protector," said the Templar gravely, "I will yet be; but mark at what risk, or rather at what certainty, of dishonour; and then blame me not if I make my stipulations, before I offer up all that I have hitherto held dear, to save the life of a Jewish maiden." "Speak," said Rebecca, "I understand thee not." "Well, then," said Bois Guilbert, "I will speak as freely as ever did doting penitent to his ghostly father, when placed in the tricky confessional. Rebecca, if I appear not in these lists, I lose fame and rank; lose that which is the breath of my nostrils, the esteem, I mean, in which I am held by my brethren, and the hopes I have of succeeding to that mighty authority, which is now wielded by the bigoted dotard, Lucas de Beaumanoir, but of which I should make a different use. Such is my certain doom, except I appear in arms against thy cause. Accursed be he of Goodalricke, who baited this trap for me, and doubly accursed Albert de Malvoisin, who withheld me from the resolution I had formed, of hurling back the glove at the face of the superstitious and superannuated fool, who listened to a charge so absurd, and against a creature so high in mind, and so lovely in form as thou art." "And what now avails rant or flattery?" answered Rebecca. "Thou hast made thy choice between causing to be shed the blood of an innocent woman, or of endangering thine own earthly state and earthly hopes. What avails it to reckon together? Thy choice is made." "No, Rebecca," said the knight in a softer tone, and drawing nearer towards her. "My choice is not made. Nay, mark, it is thine to make the election. If I appear in the lists, I must maintain my name in arms; and if I do so, championed or unchampioned, thou diest by the stake and faggot, for there lives not the knight who hath coped with me in arms on equal issue, or on terms of vantage, save Richard Cœur de Lion and his minion of Ivanhoe. Ivanhoe, as thou well knowest, is unable to bear his corslet, and Richard is in a foreign prison. If I appear, then thou diest, even although thy charms should instigate some hot-headed youth to enter the lists in thy defence." "And what avails repeating this so often?" said Rebecca. "Much," replied the Templar, "for thou must learn to look at thy fate on every side." "Well then, turn the tapestry," said the Jewess, "and let me see the other side." "If I appear," said Bois Guilbert, "in the fatal lists, thou diest by a slow and cruel death, in pain such as they say is destined to the guilty hereafter; but if I appear not, then am I a degraded and dishonoured knight, accused of witchcraft and of communion with infidels; the illustrious name which has grown yet more so under my wearing, becomes a hissing and a reproach. I lose fame, I lose honour, I lose the prospect of such greatness as scarce emperors attain to. I sacrifice mighty ambition, I destroy schemes built as high as the mountains with which heathens say their heaven was once nearly scaled. And yet, Rebecca," he said, throwing himself at her feet, "this greatness will I sacrifice, this fame will I renounce, this power will I forego, even now when it is half within my grasp, if thou wilt say, Bois Guilbert, I receive thee for my lover." "Think not of such foolishness, Sir Knight," answered Rebecca, "but hasten to the Regent, the Queen Mother, and to Prince John. They cannot, in honour to the English crown, allow of the proceedings of your Grand Master. So shall you give me protection without sacrifice on your part, or the pretext of requiring any requital from me." "With these I deal not," he continued, holding the train of her robe. "It is thee only I address; and what can counterbalance thy choice? Bethink thee, were I a fiend, yet death is a worse, and it is death who is my rival." "I weigh not these evils," said Rebecca, afraid to provoke the wild knight, yet equally determined neither to endure his passion, nor even feign to endure it. "Be a man, be a Christian! If indeed thy faith recommends that mercy which rather your tongues than your actions pretend, save me from this dreadful death, without seeking a requital which would change thy magnanimity into base barter." "No, damsel," said the proud Templar, springing up, "thou shalt not thus impose on me. If I renounce present fame and future ambition, I renounce it for thy sake, and we will escape in company. Listen to me, Rebecca," he said, again softening his tone. "England, Europe, is not the world. There are spheres in which we may act, ample enough even for my ambition. We will go to Palestine, where Conrade, Marquis of Montserrat, is my friend, a friend free as myself from the doting scruples which fetter our free-born reason. Rather with Saladin will we league ourselves, than endure the scorn of the bigots whom we condemn. I will form new paths to greatness," he continued, again traversing the room with hasty strides. "Europe shall hear the loud step of him she has driven from her sons. Not the millions whom her crusaders send to slaughter, can do so much to defend Palestine. Not the sabres of the thousands and 10,000s of Saracens can hew their way so deep into that land for which nations are striving, as the strength and policy of me and those brethren, who, in despite of yonder old bigot, will adhere to me in good and evil. Thou shalt be a queen, Rebecca. On Mount Carmel shall we pitch the throne which my valour will gain for you, and I will exchange my long-desired batoon for a sceptre." "A dream," said Rebecca, "an empty vision of the night, which, were it a waking reality, affects me not. Enough, that the power which thou mightest acquire, I will never share; nor hold I so light of country or religious faith, as to esteem him who is willing to barter these ties, and cast away the bonds of the order of which he is a sworn member, in order to gratify an unruly passion for the daughter of another people. Put not a price on my deliverance, Sir Knight; sell not a deed of generosity; protect the oppressed for the sake of charity, and not for a selfish advantage. Go to the throne of England. Richard will listen to my appeal from these cruel men." "Never, Rebecca," said the Templar fiercely. "If I renounce my order, for thee alone will I renounce it. Ambition shall remain mine, if thou refuse my love. I will not be fooled on all hands. Stoop my crest to Richard? Ask a boon of that heart of pride? Never, Rebecca, will I place the order of the Temple at his feet in my person. I may forsake the order, I never will degrade or betray it." "Now God be gracious to me," said Rebecca, "for the succor of man is well nigh hopeless." "It is indeed," said the Templar, "for, proud as thou art, thou hast in me found thy match. If I enter the lists with my spear in rest, think not any human consideration shall prevent my putting forth my strength, and think then upon thine own fate, to die the dreadful death of the worst of criminals, to be consumed upon a blazing pile, dispersed to the elements of which our strange forms are so mystically composed, not a relic left of that graceful frame, from which we could say this lived and moved. Rebecca, it is not in woman to sustain this prospect. Thou wilt yield to my suit." "Bois Guilbert," answered the Jewess, "thou knowest not the heart of woman, or hast only conversed with those who are lost to her best feelings. I tell thee, proud Templar, that not in thy fiercest battles hast thou displayed more of thy vaunted courage, than has been shown by woman when called upon to suffer by affection or duty. I am myself a woman, tenderly nurtured, naturally fearful of danger, and impatient of pain; yet, when we enter those fatal lists, thou to fight and I to suffer, I feel the strong assurance within me that my courage shall mount higher than thine. Farewell, I waste no more words on thee. The time that remains on earth to the daughter of Jacob must be otherwise spent. She must seek the Comforter, who may hide his face from his people, but who ever opens his ear to the cry of those who seek him in sincerity and in truth." "We part then thus?" said the Templar, after a short pause. "Would to heaven that we had never met, or that thou hadst been noble in birth and Christian in faith! Nay, by heaven, when I gaze on thee, and think when and how we are next to meet, I could even wish myself one of thine own degraded nation, my hand conversant with ingots and shekels, instead of spear and shield; my head bent down before each petty noble, and my look only terrible to the shivering and bankrupt debtor. This could I wish, Rebecca, to be near to thee in life, and to escape the fearful share I must have in thy death." "Thou hast spoken the Jew," said Rebecca, "as the persecution of such as thou art has made him. Heaven and ire has driven him from his country, but industry has opened to him the only road to power and to influence, which oppression has left unbarred. Read the ancient history of the people of God, and tell me if those, by whom Jehovah wrought such marvels among the nations, were then a people of misers and of usurers? And know, proud knight, we number names amongst us to which your boasted northern nobility is as the gourd compared with the cedar, names that ascend far back to those high times when the divine presence shook the mercy seat between the cherubim, and which derived their splendor from no earthly prince, but from the awful voice, which bade their fathers be nearest of the congregation to the vision. Such are the princes of the house of Jacob." Rebecca's colour rose as she boasted the ancient glories of her race, but faded as she added, with a sigh, "Such were the princes of Judah, now such no more. They are trampled down like the shorn grass, and mixed with the mire of the ways. Yet there are those among them who shame not such high descent, and of such shall be the daughter of Isaac the son of Adonikam. Farewell! I envy not thy blood-won honours. I envy not thy barbarous descent from northern heathens. I envy thee not thy faith, which is ever in thy mouth, but never in thy heart, nor in thy practice." "There is a spell on me, by heaven," said Bois Guilbert. "I almost think yon besotted skeleton spoke truth, and that the reluctance with which I part from thee hath something in it more than is natural. Fair creature," he said, approaching near her, but with great respect, "so young, so beautiful, so fearless of death, and yet doomed to die, and with infamy and agony. Who would not weep for thee? The tear, that has been a stranger to these eyelids for 20 years, moistens them as I gaze on thee. But it must be, nothing may now save thy life. Thou and I are but the blind instruments of some irresistible fatality that hurries us along, like goodly vessels driving before the storm, which are dashed against each other, and so perish. Forgive me, then, and let us part, at least, as friends part. I have assailed thy resolution in vain, and mine own is fixed as the adamantine decrees of fate." "Thus," said Rebecca, "do men throw on fate the issue of their own wild passions. But I do forgive thee, Bois Guilbert, though the author of my early death. There are noble things which cross over thy powerful mind, but it is the garden of the sluggard, and the weeds have rushed up, and conspired to choke the fair and wholesome blossom." "Yes," said the Templar, "I am, Rebecca, as thou hast spoken me, untaught, untamed, and proud, that, amidst a shoal of empty fools and crafty bigots, I have retained the preeminent fortitude that places me above them. I have been a child of battle from my youth upward, high in my views, steady and inflexible in pursuing them. Such must I remain, proud, inflexible, and unchanging; and of this the world shall have proof. But thou forgivest me, Rebecca?" "As freely as ever victim forgave her executioner." "Farewell, then," said the Templar, and he left the apartment. The Preceptor, Albert, waited impatiently in an adjacent chamber the return of Bois Guilbert. "Thou hast tarried long," he said. "I have been as if stretched on red-hot iron with very impatience. What if the Grand Master, or his spy Conrade, had come hither? I had paid dear for thy complaisance. But what ails thee, brother? Thy step totters, thy brow is as black as night. Art thou well, Bois Guilbert?" "Ay," said the Templar, "as well as the wretch who is doomed to die within an hour. Nay, by the rood, not half so well, for there be those in such state, who can lay down life like a cast-off garment. By Heaven, Malvoisin, yonder girl hath well nigh unmanned me. I am half resolved to go to the Grand Master, abjure the Order to his very teeth, and refuse to act the brutality which his tyranny has imposed on me." "Thou art mad," answered Malvoisin. "Thou mayst thus indeed utterly ruin thyself, but canst not even find a chance thereby to save the life of this Jewess, which seems so precious in thine eyes. Beaumanoir will name another of the Order to defend his judgment in thy place, and the accused will as assuredly perish as if thou hadst taken the duty imposed on thee." "'Tis false. I will myself take arms in her behalf," answered the Templar, haughtily. "And, should I do so, I think, Malvoisin, that thou knowest not one of the Order, who will keep his saddle before the point of my lance." "Ay, but thou forgettest," said the wily adviser. "Thou wilt have neither leisure nor opportunity to execute this mad project. Go to Lucas Beaumanoir, and say thou hast renounced thy vow of obedience, and see how long the despotic old man will leave thee in personal freedom. The words shall scarce have left thy lips, ere thou wilt either be 100 feet under ground, in the dungeon of the Preceptory, to abide trial as a recreant knight, or, if his opinion holds concerning thy possession, thou wilt be enjoying straw, darkness, and chains, in some distant convent cell, stunned with exorcisms, and drenched with holy water, to expel the foul fiend which hath obtained dominion over thee. Thou must to the lists, Brian, or thou art a lost and dishonoured man." "I will break forth and fly," said Bois Guilbert, "fly to some distant land, to which folly and fanaticism have not yet found their way. No drop of the blood of this most excellent creature shall be spilled by my sanction." "Thou canst not fly," said the Preceptor. "Thy ravings have excited suspicion, and thou wilt not be permitted to leave the Preceptory. Go and make the essay, present thyself before the gate, and command the bridge to be lowered, and mark what answer thou shalt receive. Thou art surprised and offended, but is it not the better for thee? Wert thou to fly, what would ensue but the reversal of thy arms, the dishonour of thine ancestry, the degradation of thy rank? Think on it. Where shall thine old companions in arms hide their heads, when Brian de Bois Guilbert, the best lance of the Templars, is proclaimed recreant, amid hisses of the assembled people? What grief will be at the court of France? With what joy will the haughty Richard hear the news, that the knight that had set him hard in Palestine, and well nigh darkened his renown, had lost fame and honour for a Jewish girl, whom he could not even save by so costly a sacrifice?" "Malvoisin," said the knight, "I thank thee. Thou hast touched the string at which my heart most readily thrills. Come of it what may, recreant shall never be added to the name of Bois Guilbert. Would to God, Richard or any of his vaunting minions of England would appear in these lists! But they will be empty; no one will risk to break a lance for the innocent, the forlorn." "The better for thee, if it proves so," said the Preceptor. "If no champion appears, it is not by thy means that this unlucky damsel shall die, but by the doom of the Grand Master, with whom rests all the blame, and who will count that blame for praise and commendation." "True," said Bois Guilbert, "if no champion appears, I am but a part of the pageant, sitting indeed on horseback in the lists, but having no part in what is to follow." "None whatever," said Malvoisin; "no more than the armed image of Saint George when it makes a part of the procession." "Well, I will resume my resolution," replied the haughty Templar. "She has despised me, repulsed me, reviled me; and wherefore should I offer up to her whatever of estimation I have in the opinion of others? Malvoisin, I will appear in the lists." He left the apartment hastily as he uttered these words, and the Preceptor followed, to watch and confirm him in his resolution; for in Bois Guilbert's fame he had himself a strong interest, expecting much advantage from his being one day at the head of the Order, not to mention the preferment, of which Montfichet had given him hopes, on condition he would forward the condemnation of the unfortunate Rebecca. Yet although, in combating his friend's better feelings, he possessed all the advantage which a wily, composed, selfish disposition has over a man agitated by strong and contending passions, it required all Malvoisin's art to keep Bois Guilbert steady to the purpose he had prevailed on him to adopt. He was obliged to watch him closely to prevent his resuming his purpose of flight, to intercept his communication with the Grand Master, lest he should come to an open rupture with his Superior, and to renew, from time to time, the various arguments by which he endeavoured to show, that, in appearing as champion on this occasion, Bois Guilbert, without either accelerating or ensuring the fate of Rebecca, would follow the only course by which he could save himself from degradation and disgrace. CHAPTR 39.